This is Hello Brain, presented by Brainovation Network. Welcome back to Hello Brain. I'm your host, Collin Adams. I'm joined today by Dr. Ramona von Leden and Dr. Dan O'Brien. Today we're talking about something every single one of us is doing, whether we like it or not, and that's aging. In this episode, we're going to cover what cognitive aging actually is, what's changing in the brain as we age, and then we'll compare some of the early signs to be aware of with the myths that come with aging and memory. So, Ramona, when you think about cognitive aging, what are some of the things that people should expect versus what are you seeing out there that people often fear?
Yeah, absolutely. I think to start with, I think aging as a term has become, like, it has this very negative connotation around it, where in reality, when we talk about the brain, I think we'll get into this quite a bit today. You know, aging doesn't mean that the brain is diminishing. It's more the brain's changing what its energy efficiency and its communication is doing. For example, there are some changes that happen that are pretty typical to your entire body with age. So it's not just specific to the brain, but those are a decrease in blood flow and cerebral blood flow. You see a little bit of a dip in mitochondrial efficiency or your ATP production. And you do see some increase in oxidative stress and a little bit of low-grade inflammation, often kind of paired with a decrease in antioxidant capacity. Again, that's part of your normal aging process. So you're basically operating under a little bit different metabolic conditions than you are when you're not aging. On the flip side, I kind of wanted to mention this as we get into thinking about the aging brain. You also have this amazing, for lack of it, you're wise, right? You have all of this information that you've built and processed over the course of your life. And so you have a lot more information in your brain than you did when you were younger as well. And so that plays in where with a little bit different metabolic activity, with a bit different energy level, sometimes you see a bit of a slowing in sort of processing. But part of that is just because you have more to get through. You have more information stored in your brain. Now, obviously, so I like to say it's kind of like you're trading speed for depth. Like when you're young, maybe you can say things and pick things up quicker. But as you're older, you have more information in there. It just might take you a little longer to access it. I think it's very common for people, of course, to be afraid to lose their memories. I think that's probably the most common fear, or to have sort of the feeling of brain fog or confusion. Anything where they feel like they can't interact with their environment is scary, right? But normal aging comes with a little slower processing speed, but you still have all of your knowledge and your reasoning. Obviously, if you have more of a degenerative pathology like Alzheimer's or something like that, that's going to change. And that's obviously what people are probably most scared of.
You make a really good point, Ramona, around mitochondrial, right? There's a lot of talk right now around mitochondrial density. How do we improve that, and just ways that we can work with this mitochondrial dysregulation, right? Or maybe dysfunction. And this could include, exercising at that zone 2. What does our nutrition look like? What does our resistance look like? We're looking at things such as saunas, cold plunge, red light therapy. And something we talked a lot about in these podcasts is deep sleep as well, and how that can remove some of the metabolic waste for us to probably maybe live longer and help support really healthy brain health.
Yeah, I agree. I also think with the brain, your brain takes about 20% of your metabolic energy that your entire body is using. It's a huge consumer of energy, right? So if you have a slow of your metabolism, if you have some change to mitochondrial function, your brain's going to show it, right? Because it's taking so much of it. And in fact, if you look at we've talked about this in some of our other podcasts, or maybe I was talking, I take that back. I talked about this on a different podcast, is what's happening in the brain in the specific regions that are impacted in sort of situations of degeneration are obviously in regions of the brain that are the most metabolically consuming. So the prefrontal cortex, your executive function, your working memory, like it takes a huge amount of energy to run that system. Similarly, your hippocampus or your default mode network, which is your medial prefrontal cortex, your posterior cingulate, these all they take a lot of energy to run them. And so if you are having again, it's very normal with age or metabolism slows, but you're going to see that affecting your ability to process things in those regions that require more energy.
So to take us a quick step back, Dr. Dan, when we say cognitive aging, what does that actually mean from a brain perspective?
Yeah, great question, Colin. I think cognitive aging, just again, as we get older, I think that our processing has slowing down. We've talked a lot about these kind of neuronal connections, these synapses that are continuously made. And as we age, if we're not doing things to take care of our cardiovascular health, our exercise, our diet, people are looking more to this Mediterranean diet, we're seeing a little bit more of that atrophy and actually leading to early onset of Alzheimer's. So we're actually aging our brain a lot quicker. And if we just take care of some of those things that are really important to our brain and nervous system, we can actually live longer and take care of our brain in a much healthier way. And yeah, we just see this atrophy. We're seeing it a lot in neuroscience right now, not only the Alzheimer's, but in the Parkinson's, and how the neurotransmitters are all playing a factor in that. So it's something to be really mindful of. And, attending some of these congresses and conferences, they are really on this. They're really on the anti-aging, longevity, these inflammatory pathways, really how important that is. This, again, like Ramona mentioned, the ATP and the mitochondrial dysfunction. So these are some things that we can do to prevent this cognitive aging. But it naturally happens, again, as we get older. But we've got to, stay with things that keep us sharp. And it's the exercise, getting rid of some of these metabolic waste. It's the diet. It's the reducing this inflammation. It's down-regulating the nervous system, spending more time in silence, too. I think often we forget about that. And that's able to really help us down-regulate. So those are some things, Colin, that kind of come to mind as far as that. It is the natural aging process, but now the way medicine's headed, even therapies that they're coming out with more therapies that you can actually live longer on these therapies. And I think as we look at AI is actually shown to, before they had to go through all these phases of trials, but now they're showing within a few months through the AI algorithms that can come up with these therapies that makes sense for helping with aging and cognitive aging. So it's a really exciting time in medicine, and there's so much going on right now.
I want to speak to that a little bit. I think, and I'm very curious because of what you just said, Dr. Dan. I think, ultimately there are three main things that we know at this point, and they're not crazy. It's diet, exercise, and sleep, right? That have the biggest influence on how you feel, how you age, how you function. And that is, as I said, very, very, very significant for the brain because of the metabolic demand. So, your glucose sensitivities, things like diabetes, these all have an impact on how you feel in your brain, especially as you age. And that also factors into things like hormone function. Our hormones change with aging, and that can also impact how we feel cognitively, whether that's your thyroid, whether that's dopamine, whether that, whatever. I say thyroid because that's probably one of the most common, but also like our insulin receptors. All of these things are impacted as part of the natural aging process most of the time. And then there's also this element of if, things go a little bit worse and you have a condition of some kind. And certainly we understand those better at this point. So Dr. Dan, when you speak to like an exciting time in medicine, I wonder if you're seeing treatments that you think are actually like new or novel, or are we just really understanding and approaching things with a more comprehensive viewpoint on the fact that we need to be more conscious of what we're putting into our body and how much activity we're getting. So that's my kind of pitch back to you.
Yeah, it's a great question. We're actually looking at things more from a health and wellness, more from holistic, identifying the root cause of things rather than just treating symptoms. And I think we're seeing this huge paradigm shift at identifying the root cause. We talk about hormones, we look at cortisol, right? We know that spikes early in the morning. How do we control things such as, like you said, the thyroid hormones and the cortisol? But again, I think we are seeing this incredible paradigm shift in the way that we are looking at diseases, the way we're getting to that root cause. And I think that is what's becoming more vital. And of course, people will say, well, it's a lot of common sense, it's diet and exercise, but there's much more to it biochemically, biophysically, that makes a lot of sense. And I think people are really starting to understand, even like the microbiome and the stomach, right, how that can affect the brain, all these various connections, right? The heart-brain connection, the heart-kidney connection, that we're just understanding. Again, I go back to this root cause, and we are seeing an incredible paradigm shift in anti-aging and longevity based on that alone.
So something that always came up for me is when I was doing the functional medicine health coaching and working with people who had come out of more of the traditional healthcare system into working with like a more holistic functional medicine style doctor was, you can do all of these things, like take this or try this biotech device, but it always seemed like in the end, it always comes back to those little lifestyle factors, like we've talked about: sleep, how we're eating, how we're moving our bodies throughout the day, how we're managing stress. And I think it's funny. It's honestly funny to me. We've drastically, from a user or an end user perspective, not necessarily a PhD, I feel like we have significantly overcomplicated the entire process when it does not need to be that way. Like, hey, if you just maybe take 10, 15 minutes away from your cell phone for, a stretch during the evening, or you get outside and experience reality and life and breathe in fresh air and move your body, wow, that can have an incredible impact on your overall well-being. Who would have thought? I mean, Who would have thought? We got to dive into all these research studies and we got to dive into this and that. But cognitive aging, again, comes back to the simple things that we can do and have control over every single day.
I think what's really interesting about the thinking about aging, when we think of aging in general, we think of things like retirement. And of course, like when you're working full time, you might, the grind and the hustle is real. We all work crazy hours and, you feel like you have to do that. And then you have this fantasy almost of like, you retire and you don't have to do anything anymore. And like, that's both good and bad, right? Rest is important, that chance to relax, to fill your day with the things that you want to do. But there's also, you see it often, I think, when you see someone who's worked, for a very long time in their career, and then they retire and they don't have anything to do and they actually decline much faster, right? There's this element of you still need to challenge your body, to challenge your brain, to give it things to do. And we talked about this, of course, in our neuroplasticity episode, but change and novelty being such a huge part of keeping your brain active and healthy is continuing to give it challenges and continuing to give it to new things to do. So I'm going to use my mom as an example. When my mom retired, she's busier than she ever was. She's learning like 3 languages. Yes, she's on Duolingo. There's our plug. She also, she's doing activities that she never picked up before. She started practicing yoga. She was never a yoga person before. She's the epitome of the person who's not letting her brain slow down. Now, to a fault, sometimes I feel like she's got a bit of like FOMO. And so she's like, I got to fit it all in before I die. And I'm like, okay, but you still have to give your brain some time to rest and recover. And as you said, Collin, like get out in nature. You don't have to constantly be stimulating your brain. But, I think it used to be we would talk about things like crossword puzzles and Sudoku and stuff like that being like, oh, that's how you keep your brain healthy. That can be healthy, but I think it's more than that. I think it's more novelty, learning about yourself, learning about the world, travel, things that just shake up your life are really what keep your brain plastic and healthy.
I'm curious to know when the concept of retirement came about and developed and how that happened, because I spent about a month in Southeast Asia last fall, and I just remember as I was there walking around and seeing people that I would imagine were probably in their 80s or 90s were still working, they were still contributing, they were part of communities who were doing things, and it doesn't seem like that's the same here in every case. And so I'm curious how that shift happened and how it plays into cognitive aging and maybe some of the increased instances of neurodegenerative disease that we're seeing now.
Yeah, Collin, I think I'll jump on that really quick, is the fact that the social interactions, the social engagement, it sounds cliche, but it's being talked about a lot, especially at some of these conferences, anti-aging longevity conferences. Just having that social engagement, I think, helps us form those new neuronal connections, which I think is important. So I think, to your point, is these individuals living in these communities, I think it's fantastic, right? Being surrounded by people socially can be very uplifting, very positive, but also very engaging. I think to Ramona's point and your point, Collin, it keeps those synapses moving. It keeps us kind of that novelty going with those social interactions. Again, sounds like common sense, but I think if we look at putting, retired people in communities where they can be socially involved and engaged, we can see better health outcomes, and they can actually have improved quality of life.
Yeah, I definitely back that up, Dan. I totally agree. I think we often, when we think about ourselves as a species, we don't think about ourselves in like comparing us to other animals, but we're animals. We're social creatures. We are meant to live in communities. We're not meant to be alone. And as much as there's positive, I love alone time. It's one of my favorite things in the world. But you know, if I'm alone all of the time, then it's not so great. There's just such a huge part of being human that is that engagement, that is that socialization. And I think on the flip side of now we're talking about it, of course, as you age. And I think maybe that's one reason. I don't know that every retirement community is perfect, but the idea of a retirement community, of having someplace where you're surrounded by people all the time who are your age that you can engage with, because society doesn't always provide you with that in the home, is actually a really positive thing. I know like in European countries, like it's always Norway, right? Norway's always the ones that are doing stuff like this, but they have like these really robust, engaged social communities that people live out their lives in, and they age very healthy, and they age with a lot of contentment because they are surrounded by community.
Yeah, and I just wonder how we've arranged our society, at least in the US, maybe North America as a whole, to completely burn both ends of the candle for a stretch of 30 to 40 years in the name of being able to just like shut it down when we hit a certain age. And it's interesting. I don't know that we necessarily have to answer that. That's probably a bigger question than what can be held here in the next 30 minutes. But I just think it's really curious to see that different cultures and how they approach aging and how they approach community and how they approach work and retirement. So
yeah, and I think one thing too, Colin, I think that's really interesting there is the fact that if we look at COVID, right, to go back to that really quick, the fact that it allowed us all to take a pause, it allowed the whole world, especially our country, to take a step back and say, you know what, whatever your take is on COVID, did it exist, did it not exist? But the fact that we all took a pause, that people were traveling like maniacs, flying, hotels, everything. We're moving so fast at a rapid pace. Industry people, executives, everybody, right? Physicians, lawyers, I mean, you name it. The fact that we're able to take time and look back, but maybe we needed that as a society. We needed something like that to kind of slow us down, kind of in an indirect way, right? Again, whether people are believers or they're not believers. And I know people, again, had lost their lives during COVID, but I think it taught a lot of us to slow down and reflect and maybe spend time in community, spend time in family, look at our lives a little bit differently rather than continue at 150 miles an hour. And we know, again, what that's doing to our brain health and our cognition and the sequelae of events that are happening because of that. So it's interesting to look back. Maybe we'll look back in 30 years and say that was an interesting time in our lives, 5-6 years ago, what had happened and where we're at today with it.
Yeah, I think to kind of steer this back to really putting that in context of the brain, as you said, Dan, I totally agree with you that prior to COVID, and I think honestly that people are trying to make up for lost time now, and it's kind of gotten back to it where people are going 8,000 miles an hour and constantly traveling, and you're always on your phones and you're always checking your work email and you're always doing stuff. And I'm 100% as guilty of this as the next person. But what we were essentially, one of the downsides of technology, it's both a good and a bad, is that we have access to so much at our fingertips, where you can get your work email on your phone. You can get your work email anywhere in the world. Whereas, maybe before you did your work at the office and then you left for the day and you didn't have a way to look at your work email from somewhere else. So you went home and you separated from your job. And that allowed, when it comes into the context of the brain, time for your brain to process what you had done that day. And this is such an important part of it. So, coming back to sort of different parts of our brain, there's an analogy I really like to use when I think about the older brain or the adult brain. When you're a young brain, you're basically like your neighborhood, or you're like the neighborhood libraries, the free libraries, right? There's a few books in there. You could probably read them all and you know them backwards and forwards. And then as you get older, you're more like the county library. You have so much information in there and you have more data, you have more knowledge, but it's going to take you longer to both process new data because you have to file it away in a big, cabinet of different things. It's also going to take you a longer time to remember it. And so if you're constantly grinding and you're constantly working, and you're not giving yourself adequate rest, you will diminish your ability to process all of that new data. And that's why that separation and that time apart from sort of the grind is so valuable, and why, I mean, we've talked about it as sleep specifically, but it's more than just sleep. It's rest, it's recovery. It's just vital to being able to allow your brain enough time to basically like clean up and organize.
Yeah, and Ramona, we talked in episode 2 of this show about neuroplasticity, and then followed it in episode 3 talking about how AI is influencing neuroplasticity. And I think you just talked about some of the things that are really important. And as we age, I'm wondering, when you think about the idea, the example you gave of the library, and this library is expanding, if we aren't taking the time now as 30, 40, 50-year-olds to really process the information we're taking in, but the information is just going to keep coming, and probably at a more rapid rate than it used to, and we're not taking those breaks from taking in information, how do you think that is going to essentially turn neuroplasticity into a negative, because the brain's going to take what you give it, to like change the brain structurally and functionally as we continue to age?
Oh, Colin, that's a really good question. I may need a second to think on that, as to how we'll kind of, I mean, I think you're going to see kind of, it's incomplete projects, it's incomplete connections, right? Again, as your brain processes information, as it goes through the memory consolidation process that you see largely in the hippocampus, but also in other regions of the brain, that's how those new connections are made. That's how your new neural networks strengthen. And if you aren't giving your brain adequate time to do that, then you have kind of loose ends. And you have some memory, but not all of it, right? Maybe you're slower to integrate the information. Your recall might not be as good.
It's interesting that's a great way to say it. And this morning in our Brain Innovation Network team huddle, we're always like, on Monday, it's always like, what'd you do this weekend? And I literally sat there for 5 to 10 seconds and was like, I already don't remember. And that's wild, because once I actually took the time to think about it after the meeting was over, I was like, oh yeah, I did this and this and this. And it was actually a really nice weekend. I enjoyed it a lot. But I can look back on the weekend and I can say, like, yeah, I was a little too plugged in digitally. Like, I definitely checked my email a few times. I was texting friends. I was watching shows. And maybe I didn't give my brain that time to really process the prior week, but also what was happening on the weekend. And I think about the movie, what's it called? Inside Out, where you've got like the main center in the middle where all those emotions are hanging out around the switchboard. And then you've got these bridges going off of it back out into like these core sections of the person's personality. And in a kind of similar way, I feel like if we're not taking the time to really, like Dan's reference, be alone and be away from digital media and away from our tech to really cognitively process all of this information we're taking in, like you said, Ramona, those bridges are incomplete as we age. And when something's incomplete, there can be breaks and fractures and dead zones and construction happening. And if we think about those 4 kind of ideas, that's really the conversation of neurodegeneration that we're having today, is this whole brain that has either construction projects or breakdowns or potholes or in not connected bridges all over it. And there are things certainly that we can be doing when we're young that contribute to how our brain is structurally as we age.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, continuing on this conversation, I think that there's this narrative of aging. You hear it, whether it's brain or physical. Like on Friday, this past week, I was vacuuming, and every once in a while I decided to move all of the furniture in the living room to vacuum, and so this was one of those times. And I picked up a table that was like very light, maybe 25 pounds at the most, and immediately just felt this sharp pain in my lower back. And I'm 30 years old, so I eclipsed that last year in September, and I couldn't believe it. I picked up a light table and then I was down for the rest of the day. Like I couldn't get up and do things. I couldn't bend over at all. And so we always talk about aging. We always automatically go to this idea of decline. Like with the brain specifically, it's forgetting names, losing sharpness. Maybe you don't have spatial awareness like you used to. I'll ask this to both of you, but Ramona, to start with you, how much of that is actually true, would you say, that narrative?
Sure. Also, first of all, I'm just going to say that something about being an adult is you realize that your worst injuries come from the silliest things. It's not a cool like injury. Or like I picked up a table. No, I once threw out my back folding clothes. No joke. And I'm like a very active person. Like,
Or even
it's not
sneezing, right? I think people sneeze and throw their back out.
Right, exactly. There's an element that just, the body's funny that way. So as I've kind of said a couple of times in this podcast today, I don't think aging is us losing capacity. I think it's a change in capacity. It's more about what we have available to us because of cellular changes that start to happen over 42, 43. We see mutations in our DNA. We see changes that actually lead to a higher, like low level inflammation. There are things we can do nutritionally to help supplement that. But again, if you understand that your body just can't, you're aging, you are losing the capacity to produce as much of those things that kept you young, shall we say, then you can kind of work to support it with nutrition, with diet, with exercise, with sleep. But it's not that we've lost it. It's just we need to learn how to support it better. That's my personal opinion on it. I think it's also to factor in when you are 30 years old, thinking about how the things that you're doing now are going to influence your brain later. Not specifically for brains, but I know in the body itself, there's this like window between 40 and about 55 where the amount of your bone density and the strength training that you do basically sets you up for what you're going to look like when you quote retire. And it's so vital that between those ages of 40 and 55 that you are really creating and strengthening your bones so that you're set up to age gracefully. And with the highest level of health you can. And there's a lot of data on that where people who don't do strength training in that age group, you'll see them declining much faster, a higher level of osteoporosis. And I think very similarly about the brain, what we do now is you're building your brain for later. So if you are supporting it now, you're keeping it healthy, you're keeping it robust, it has that ability to be a strong muscle for you. Then when you're 65, that muscle's already, it's able to take care of itself better as it starts to lose some of its capacity.
Yeah, and from my perspective, I think it's always looking at how do we reinvent ourselves, right? I go back to working at an early age, right? And always thinking about, during school or during work, how do I reinvent myself? As I age, as I continually, every decade, right? Or every year that goes by, what are ways I can create more awareness, more education for myself to learn more, to keep that kind of competitive edge at work, so to speak, and also in my fitness and my brain health. So I'm always looking at how do I reinvent my skill set, stay sharp with that, to continue on to have a healthy brain. And I think as we age gracefully, I think we have to always look at ways to challenge ourselves in regards to how we reinvent ourselves.
That's a great answer. And Dr. Dan, I know you've talked a lot about meditation as one of those practices that you've picked up on more recently and have really taken to. What's maybe one thing as we start to wrap up this episode that you would want someone in their 30s or 40s to understand now about their brain and then maybe begin to do?
Yeah, just to answer your first question really quick, since I was an athlete before too, and I had lower back injury as well, and I'll tell you that meditation and yoga helps that tremendously with the flexibility, with the stretching. I even think with the down regulation too. of stress too, that, we're all living very busy lives. So I think that really helped as well. So I think I'm a firm believer of meditation, of yoga, of the mindfulness to be able to create that peace. And I think as we age, you have to be able to have that peace and that silence in certain aspects. And I think that leads to a better quality of life and more graceful aging by having that peace. And I think that can come through yoga and meditation to have that appropriate aging and brain health.
I love that answer. That's excellent.
Yeah, I like that answer, but I'm also going to add that from my perspective, novelty and challenge on the flip side, which not that there aren't elements of that in yoga, but I think that to me, if there's one thing that you can be doing, it's don't be set in your ways. It's learn about things that might be uncomfortable. Do those things that allow you to continue to grow and learn as a human, and that's going to strengthen and support your brain to work harder as well.
Absolutely. I love that. So novelty and challenge, and then also buying into meditation or just taking time to be alone and be by yourself. So thanks so much for listening, everyone. Today we talked about the what of cognitive aging. Come back next week for part 2, where we'll discuss the how for prevention, optimization, and longevity. As always, if you've been enjoying the show, we would love to hear from you. Please leave a review, drop a comment, and share this with someone who might benefit. We'll see you next time. You've been listening to Hello Brain, presented by Brainovation Network.